What's the most messed up thing someone has confessed to you confidently? I interviewed someone many years ago to be a department manager. Solid guy, really knew his stuff. Hired him. He was great with staff, knew how to work with clients, grasped all the nuances of the job, including the boring administrative stuff that we all hate, but he was spot on with it. There was another employee there with whom he had great rapport. She wasn't his direct report, but she and he seemed to get along just super well. Chemistry, as if they knew each other for years. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing beyond just being able to effectively work interdepartmentally. And when they worked on projects together, they were on task, focused, and delivered. Now, this guy had fairly good chemistry with everyone else as well, but this one female just was like they were coordinated. He had been with me for about 2 months. He was in my office one day. We were having lunch and just chatting about all topics do not work related. The subject of family came up from him, not me. I told him my story is short. No kids. Almost all family is dead, so I don't have anyone anymore except me and my spouse. He smiled and nodded in what I would say is a kindly, empathetic way. At this point, he told me he had a large family, an extended family, and started to give a small history lesson. This guy has a lot of family. A lot. As he's going down the list, he starts rattling off names. And one of them is the female I mentioned above. Find out she's his great niece. Well, that explains how and why they get so well when they work. They're family. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, we have no problems with family members/relatives working for us. Not an issue. As he concludes his conversation, he says to me, "You know, right?" I said, "No. I had no idea you two were related, but it makes sense now." He looks at me, and he has a serious look on his face and says, "No, you know about us, right?" I looked confused, I assume, and said, "I don't know what you mean." He said, "My youngest daughter. She's the mother." That took me about 45 to 60 seconds to fully process what he was telling me. I finally said something like, "Nope, had no idea. Okay, great, this was fun. Let's do this again soon. My best employee is related to another good employee. It's great uncle and great niece, and they've messed up and have a kid together." Oh, he was in his late 60s, and she was in her exceedingly early 20s. I checked and checked, but we had no policy against such. He quit about a month later. She stuck around about another month and also quit. I strongly suspect it was due to him spilling the news to me, which to this day, I just don't understand why he shared what he did beyond her being his great niece. In that moment, he just chose to share. I assume it was due to the great sushi we just had for lunch. Thus, that story takes top spot in my book. I had a rough divorce. Kids were teenagers, overly dramatic wife. It was a mess. The final straw in the marriage was my wife receiving an FB message from a stranger claiming they saw me embracing and having an affair with a woman who closely fit the description of one of my co-workers. I was not. A few years after the divorce, I started dating that same co-worker after I had left the company, and after a while, she invited me to move into her home, which I did. We started a business together, and she asked me to look up some purchase orders on her computer. I opened the laptop, and Facebook was open to a profile I instantly remembered as that stranger. I was actually confused and brought the computer to her and asked how this person's profile could be logged in on her computer. She took the computer from me with a proud smile and said, "It's really easy to create a fake profile on Facebook," and winked at me while she took the computer into her office. I thought my chest was going to burst. She destroyed my family because she was having a crush on me at work. To be fair, we were having issues, but breaking up the family was never mentioned until my wife got that message. I moved out a few weeks later. When I was an undergraduate, I played on a club sports team for 1 season. A core group of players lived in a communal house and had a big end of the season party. I stopped by some friends for some drinks, but left early. I liked playing, but I didn't know them all that well. The next week, I ran into one of them in one of the cafeterias. He was telling me about the party, how I should have stuck around. Then he pointed out a first-year girl who was sitting at one of the tables and said, "She got shit-faced drunk, and a bunch of us pulled a train on her. I thought I was going to get sick. I don't remember what I said, but I left. I did tell a bunch of my friends. We smoked a lot of dope. We drank a lot of alcohol, and we chased after a lot of women, but that was not in our mentality. I never went back or hung out with the team again. The most messed up thing was not that they did it. Hell, it wasn't a confession he gave me. He was bragging. It was sick. But the most messed up thing was I did nothing about it. I didn't go to the police officers. I didn't try to get her help. I just walked away from the situation. And that's messed up. I should have done something, anything. Instead, I just took the coward's way out. My best friend's dad ate a shotgun about 20 years ago after his wife left him. I wasn't there when the police officers found and removed the body, but I did help clean up the crime scene, because nobody tells you that you're responsible for that, and crime scene cleanup crews are expensive, and prep the house for sale. My friend and his family went through therapy for a while, and then they moved across the country to be closer to his mom's friends, but we kept in touch. A few years ago, they temporarily moved back into the area before settling in a neighboring state, and I helped them with the move. My friend hadn't arrived yet, so it was just me helping basically a second mom, and when we stopped for lunch, she pretty much told me everything. Her ex-husband had been extremely abusive, but was really good at hiding it, so it took her over a decade to get out. The dad had bought a shotgun, updated the beneficiaries on his own life insurance policy, and took out policies on mom and all three of their kids, naming the aunt as beneficiary on all policies. He ate the shotgun a couple of weeks later. We think he had a last-minute change of heart about killing his kids, but we'll never know. They're all grown, some with families of their own, and they are quite happy as they are. So I don't think it will do any good to tell any of them, and I have no intention of doing so their mom can, if she wants. The closest I can come to a friend confessing something messed up to me, at least he thought he'd messed up, was when a guy who was one of my best friends told me his secret. He told me we really had to talk, in private. So I took him to my office and shut the door. Poor fellow looked miserable and like he was almost in tears. Now, kept in mind, we were remarkably close. We bled together in Vietnam and had stayed friends from then to right now. He started with, "You're going to hate me, and I won't blame you if you beat the shit out of me. I deserve it." I mean, now he was beginning to worry me. What could he have done that I'd want to support him? It took him a moment to collect himself, and then he told me the dirty secret. "I'm sorry, friend. I am so sorry. I betrayed you." LOL. I literally laughed so hard I was crying. "You mean Nancy?" And he nodded. Looking at the floor, I am unable to face me. Oh geez, man. You're poor SOB. If Nancy decided she wanted a piece of you, you didn't stand a chance. If she decided the Pope should lose his virginity, she'd have it, and would then probably want to add a nun to her list of conquests. That gal could seduce a statue. You don't have to apologize to me, bud. Oh, it was funny. I told the poor fellow to go back and get some more off her. He needed relief. His wife had cleared their bank account and went off with another fellow a couple of years before this time. So, he was a bachelor again, and I knew he wasn't getting much action in bed. He wasn't much of a ladies' man, kind of shy around women, actually. I worked at Subway when I was 15, and I had a coworker named Michelle. Michelle was my dad's age, about 50. In fact, I later found out they graduated high school together. She was a bit socially oblivious, a very loud talker, quite crass, very rude and condescending to myself and the other teenage employees. I was the only opener in that age group, and because of that she got to sleeping on weekends and tended to be a bit of friends with me those days. Well, because at Subway, mornings tend to be quite slow, and one day she starts talking to me about her sons that were a bit older than me. She tells me that her former husband was allergic to danger, but her sons really wanted a pet. They decided on a bearded dragon. They got their bearded dragon and were quite happy. His name was Skippy. Skippy liked to sit on the arm of the couch and watch TV with the boys after dinner apparently. Well, one day, her sons want to play outside with Skippy and decide to take him on the trampoline. Michelle, with this really odd, dead-eyed, almost gleeful tone, tells me how she came home to Skippy exploded all over the trampoline. I live in California, and in 2016/2017, I used to take Ubers all the time to buy weed from one of the dispensaries before they had the completely legal ones, and people tell you some crazy things when A, they know they'll never encounter you again, and B, they find out you don't mind towing the legal line, using loopholes to get an otherwise illegal thing. I would normally set the ride up to be there and then back to my apartment, and most of the time as soon as I got in the car I'd tell them where we're going just in case they weren't comfortable giving me a ride after. None of them ever had an issue with it. I had a lot of old guys that would start talking about how they used to smoke a lot back in the day and bring up other minor illicit activities of theirs. There was this one guy in particular, though. He was an older guy who on the way back to my apartment he asked if he could smell what I got. I hand him the capsule of weed I just bought. He opens it and takes a big whiff. He starts reminiscing aloud to me, but not just about weed, about cocaine, how he used to sell it. He brings up something I felt he should have kept to himself. He tells me he and a friend of his were set to meet someone to either buy or sell some coke to. They arrive at the motel with their half and head to the room. He says upon entering the room the guy they're supposed to meet is there already. He's dead. Apparently still with his half of the trade in the room with him, so my Uber driver and his friend decides to leave with both halves, their own and the dead guy's. They never heard anything about it after. Now I had so many questions like, how did this guy they were there to meet would seem to have died? Was this someone they dealt with before? Just how large of a deal was this? And why are you telling me? My only conclusion is the story was either completely made up by him on the spot, or this guy has just had this on his conscience for so long, building up, that he felt the need to get it out to someone. Someone he felt he'd never see again, and was at least just barely, even if only a sliver, a part of that underworld. My grandfather was born in 1919, so for my whole life, he was just a silly old guy who loved to make us laugh with jokes and stories of a different time. It wasn't until after he passed that I found out he was known as El Chino in his youth and was the boss of the local Zoot suit-wearing Pachucos. At his funeral, one of his lifelong friends told me about a time-unknown local man with a neighborhood girl. El Chino rounded up his boys and they supported that guy, breaking his arm before my grandfather stuck a gun in his mouth and told him to leave town that night and never come back. That's the kind of man your abuelo was. He never let anyone get away with anything on our side of the tracks. It was absolutely jarring to think of my grandfather that way. He came home after that and told my grandmother what he had done, and she was so afraid he'd end up in trouble that she took the gun and hid it and went to her final rest decades later, without revealing where it was. Weeks after my grandfather's funeral, we were emptying the house, and we turned up a revolver in a shoebox hidden in a crawl space, and the story I heard that day immediately came back to me. When I was in my early 20s and living in Houston, I was heavily addicted to cocaine, and in order to pay for it, I would go to script doctors and sell the pills they gave. When Hurricane Katrina hit, Houston was flooded with refugees from Louisiana, and there was one particular apartment complex that seemed to have only been filled with New Orleans gang members and street prostitutes. I would say that roughly 70% of the people living in these apartments sold crack and powder cocaine. So I got to know quite a few of them and would either sell or trade my pills for their coke. All of the people living there scared me. It was an effortless process. I would walk up to the apartment gate, stand there for a few minutes, and someone would come up and ask me if I wanted anything. I would then ask them the same thing, and next thing I know, the transaction was complete. Every time I went, it would be someone new. The last time when I was approached by a black guy with long hair driving a Cadillac convertible. He was in his early 20s and asked me the same question everyone else asked. When I told him what I had, he told me to come up to his apartment to get more for the trade. I said okay and followed him through the complex. We went through building after building until finally coming to the very last building on the property, which seemed to be empty. When we got to the second floor, I saw nothing but caution tape on all the doors and a partially caved-in roof at the end of the hall. I watched as he went to one of the doors, pulled out a key, and opened the apartment. I was shocked by someone who lived in this environment but had seen worse, so I decided to follow him in. We started talking about trade and working out a deal for future transactions. We finally settled on a deal where I would go to 2 doctors a week for him, and he would supply my addiction to me. I went to a doctor a day every week, so it was a great deal for me. He paid the $120 doc visit, paid for prescriptions, and gave me drugs, and I would still have 5 more doc visits a week where I just made profit on the pills sold. After the deal was made, he told me to wait in the apartment while he went next door for the coke. Then he walked out the door and locked the handle. After about 15 minutes, I got restless and went to let myself out, but when I tried the door, I found that I was locked in. He had taken over this abandoned apartment and changed the lock to only lock from the outside. I started to be scared. I tried every room to see if I could leave, and when I went to the second bedroom, I was greeted by a girl dressed in a dirty yellow sundress. She was white, about 19 years old, and absolutely filthy. She told me to relax and that he would be back eventually, and just to have a seat until he is. There's so much more, but I'm trying to shorten as best I can, so you all don't have to read too much. We started talking, and I asked her where she was from, and asked about Katrina. Basic small talk. For some reason, she begins to tell me how she ended up on the street. Here's what she said. When she was a sophomore in high school, she started dating a guy who was about 20 years old. He was pretty abusive and would shoot her up with drugs, but she stayed with him. One day, he picked her up from school, and on the way home, they saw one of her classmates walking. They pulled up to her and offered her a ride. Apparently, she didn't get along too well with the one telling me this story, but they eventually convinced her to go with them. Also, they were headed in the same direction because they lived only a few houses away from the girl. The boyfriend had been drinking and offered the girl a drink. She said no, which irritated the boyfriend, who then hit the girl across her face with a vodka bottle. He then pulled down a side road, beat her face multiple times, and assaulted. Then they took the girl's body and buried it in an area behind the dead girl's house. She told me all this in the calmest way possible, like it was nothing. She then said that her and her boyfriend never went back to her actual house, had not seen her parents in years. I then realized who locked me in the apartment. Eventually he came back, and I asked if he wanted to take me to a doctor that day. He said he would, and we left. When he stopped for gas, I said I'd pay and walked in the store and then out the opposite doors. I then ran into an adult bookstore where I paid to go into the theater that was there. I then hid inside a booth for 8 hours until they kicked me out. I walked home, constantly looking over my shoulder. I never went back to that apartment complex. I rented a room from an older guy, Rob, in the late 1980s in college. Rob, he was a super cool man. He was a Vietnam vet and had that air of someone who had seen something weird. He was a nurse at a local hospital and worked an early shift. Great guy. I knew tons of stuff. Everyone in our little neighborhood liked and appreciated him. I could go to the local Irish pub and get in without an ID because everyone there knew I was his housemate. Rob was also an extremely high-functioning alcoholic. He would get completely blasted every single evening, but be up and sober and out of the house by 5 a.m. for his shift. Never saw him drink during the day. At the end of the school year, I had just finished all my finals and papers and was getting ready to head out for a study year abroad in a few days. That evening, Rob asked if I wanted to celebrate with him. We started with a bottle of Jameson, about 3/4 full. About 4 drinks in, Rob started to go into his inebriated side. In the year that I'd lived with him, he never spoke about Vietnam, and I knew better than to ask. But that evening he asked if I wanted to know what he did there. I had always assumed he was a nurse or medic there, or had just been a regular GI who had done the usual horrible war stuff. Turns out he was part of the Phoenix program. Basically, he was sent into North Vietnam on CIA assassination missions. He was a sniper. A lot of his targets seemed to be civilians. He said he drank because he saw the faces of the people he killed every evening. He also said a lot of other stuff that I don't remember, for obvious reasons. Anyway, we ended up polishing off the bottle that night. The next morning, I heard him get up and out of the house at 5 a.m. I spent the entire day alternating between praying to the porcelain god and curling up in a fetal position on my futon. We never spoke of it again. In the 70s, my 15M girlfriend 15F was remarkably close, adventurous, no boundaries, eager to try and do everything naive kids do when exploring relationships. We became closer after our 16th birthdays, a present to each other, if you will. We attended a co-ed boarding school, so we were together all the time, sneaking out at night to each other's dorms. An exciting time for us. One afternoon, she casually told me about her uncle who she visited during holidays and had for years. She was an only child, being adopted into the family. My dearest friend explained how her uncle was the only one who really loved her, and she felt that I was as loving as my uncle, so I was someone special to her as well, as she was to me. They had discussed intercourse, but the uncle wanted her to lose her virginity to someone her age. The uncle passed away the same year. We went our separate ways after school, but stayed in touch. She became pregnant and was sent away to have the baby boy, who was adopted out immediately. She thought nothing of it. She had a tumultuous life as a young adult where nobody understood her bad mood swings, and things would regularly go to custard around her. In the late 80s, she died in a car crash trying to overtake a bus. As I've aged and become wiser, I now recognize the behaviors she were of a groomed young girl by her pedophile uncle. She identified affection and interest in her as some sort of physical thing which triggered an enthusiasm for physical contact. Possibly bipolar, I seemed to be a rare stabilizing presence, and her parents always greeted me warmly. Her life was wasted from the greed of a pedophile. After 50 years, I still wonder if things could have been better for her. My mom told me that she originally wanted to abort me. My dad had drinking and gambling problems, and they could barely afford rent while feeding my older sister what little scraps they had. So, my mom got fed up and was close to leaving my dad. But then she got pregnant with me. He convinced her to keep the pregnancy, promising that he'd stop gambling and change for the new baby. He didn't. We eventually became homeless. My mom finally left him and took my sister and me with her. Years later, we're financially stable and everything is good. No idea where Dad is. Objectively, I understand why my mom wanted to abort me. She also said she didn't want me to suffer extreme poverty as a baby. And I did go through a lot because of my family's circumstances. But emotionally, it's hard for me to get over it. My dad essentially used me to baby trap my mom into staying in an abusive relationship with him. If it weren't for me, my mom and sister wouldn't have suffered so much. I know it's not my fault, but it still feels like it is. I also know that my mom loves me very much, but I also feel pain knowing that she originally didn't want me. In a better world, I shouldn't exist.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.